In the early years of the 19th century, Europe was not merely a continent at war, it was a cage. The bars were forged of French steel, and the jailer was a man whose ambition knew no earthly bounds, Napoleon Bonaparte. From the jagged coasts of Portugal to the snow-dusted plains of Austerlitz, the Grande Armée swept aside empires with terrifying ease. Kings bowed, generals surrendered. The map of the world was being rewritten in French ink. To the outside observer, the war was a clash of titans on the open field. Cannons roaring, cavalry charging, the glorious and bloody theatre of battle. But while history books often focus on the thunder of Waterloo or the tragedy of Trafalgar, they frequently miss the quieter, deadlier war that raged in the shadows. This was a conflict fought not with muskets, but with whispers, not with artillery, but with forged documents, not on the muddied fields of Belgium, but in the dimly lit back rooms of Parisian courts and the cold, foggy alleys of London. This is the story of that unseen war, a story where the battlefield was the mind of the enemy, and the soldiers were spies, saboteurs, and traitors. By 1793, Britain found itself in a position of perilous isolation. The island nation stood as the last stubborn obstacle to total French hegemony. But Britain was small. Its army was a fraction the size of the French war machine. William Pitt the Younger, the British Prime Minister, stared at a map of Europe that was turning agonizingly blue, the colour of France. He realized that if Britain were to survive, let alone win, it could not play by the rules of chivalry. If the front door of France was barred by the greatest army the world had ever seen, Britain would have to pick the lock of the back door. Enter William Wickham. To the casual observer, Wickham was a mild-mannered diplomat, a man of letters and bureaucracy. But beneath the powdered wig and the stiff collar lay the mind of a predator. Wickham was the architect of the Alien Office, an innocuous-sounding bureau that was, in reality, the beating heart of British intelligence. He understood a fundamental truth that his military counterparts often missed. Napoleon's empire was vast, but it was brittle. It was built on the shaky foundations of revolution, regicide, and fear. Wickham's plan was audacious. He would not just spy on France, he would infect it. He envisioned a network of agents that would penetrate the very skin of the Napoleonic regime, burrowing deep into the judiciary, the police, and the administration. He didn't just want to know what Napoleon was planning. He wanted to control what Napoleon saw, what his judges decided, and what his people believed. The first step was money. Rivers of it. The British Treasury quietly funneled vast sums, millions in modern currency, into Wickham's hands. This was not for munitions, but for bribery. The goal was to turn the French state against itself. Wickham established his base of operations not in London, but on the continent, in Switzerland, and later Germany, placing himself dangerously close to the enemy to shorten the lines of communication. From there, he began to spin a web. His targets were not the fanatical Jacobins or the die-hard Bonapartists. He looked for the cracks in the armour. He sought out the disgruntled royalists, the men who had lost everything in the revolution, the bitter generals who felt overshadowed by Napoleon's brilliance, and, perhaps most crucially, the greedy, underpaid clerks who greased the wheels of the French bureaucracy. This was the birth of the Foreign Office Secret Service, the ancestor of modern MI6. It was a professional, systematic approach to subversion. Wickham wasn't sending scouts to count cannons. He was sending agents to buy souls. The stakes could not have been higher. If Wickham failed, the gold would be lost, the agents executed, and Britain's reputation shattered. But if he succeeded, if he could plant a seed of rot in the heart of Paris, then the mighty Grande Armée might find itself fighting a war on two fronts, one against the British redcoats and another against a phantom enemy that struck from within its own walls. The stage was set for a collision between two masterminds. William Wickham, the British spy master, and his terrifying counterpart in Paris, Joseph Fouché, the Minister of Police. It was to be a duel of wits that would decide the fate of nations, played out in the silent, terrifying arena of the unseen war. To understand how British intelligence planned to dismantle an empire, we must first understand the nature of the enemy. Napoleon's France was not just a military dictatorship. It was a bureaucratic leviathan. Every citizen, every traveller, every bushel of wheat was accounted for by a sprawling network of clerks, magistrates, and police commissioners. On the surface, this bureaucracy was Napoleon's greatest strength, allowing him to mobilize armies and crush dissent with ruthless efficiency. But to William Wickham, this vast administrative machine was not a fortress. It was a target. Wickham realized that a spy in a general's tent could learn of a battle plan, but a spy in the judiciary could alter the reality of the state itself. The courts and the police administration held the keys to the kingdom. They controlled the passports, the travel permits, and the prison cells. If the British could infiltrate this layer of French society, they would effectively possess the keys to Napoleon's house. The infiltration began not in the gilded halls of Paris, but on the stormy waters of the English Channel. Under the cover of moonless nights, the Royal Navy played a crucial, silent role. Ships commanded by daring officers like Captain John Wesley Wright would slip close to the French coast, navigating treacherous currents to drop off their cargo. This cargo was not gunpowder or muskets, but men. These agents were members of the Agence de Paris and the secretive Chevaliers de la Foi, or Knights of the Faith. They were French royalists, men who had sworn eternal enmity to the usurper Bonaparte, now bankrolled and directed by British gold. They would row ashore in small cutters, landing on the desolate cliffs of Biville in Normandy. There, a rope ladder, left by a local smuggler paid in British sovereigns, would be their only bridge between the freedom of the open sea and the tyranny of the police state. Once ashore, the true danger began. These men had to shed their identities and vanish into the fabric of French society. This brings us to the most ingenious aspect of the operation, the weaponization of bureaucracy. British forgers in London, working with stolen templates, created masterpieces of deception. They produced internal passports, certificates of citizenship, and travel visas that were indistinguishable from the real thing. Armed with these papers, the agents didn't hide in caves or forests. They walked straight into the lion's den. They took up residence in Paris, leasing apartments in respectable districts. They weren't looking for military secrets. They were looking for jobs. Through bribery and the exploitation of old family connections, these agents infiltrated the lower and middle rungs of the judicial system. They became clerks in the tribunals, secretaries to magistrates, and functionaries in the police commissariats. They became the invisible men of the regime. To a pompous French magistrate, a clerk was nothing more than a piece of furniture, a hand to hold a quill. They were ignored, overlooked, and underestimated. And that is exactly what Wickham counted on. From these vantage points, the British network began to operate with impunity. An agent working as a filing clerk could misplace a dossier, ensuring that a fellow spy arrested by the police would never go to trial because the evidence had mysteriously vanished. An agent in the passport office could issue legitimate travel papers to a hit squad arriving from London, allowing them to move through France as authorized merchants. One of the most effective groups was the Chevaliers de la Foi. They were organized like a Masonic lodge, a secret society within a society. They didn't just want to gather intelligence, they wanted to prepare the ground for a counter-revolution. They successfully placed their members in the National Guard and the local municipal councils. They were sleeper agents in the truest sense, waiting for the signal to turn their administrative power against the emperor. This was deep cover on a scale rarely seen in history. These men lived double lives for years, attending revolutionary festivals, shouting "Long live the emperor" when required, and diligently filing the paperwork of the regime they were sworn to destroy. They were sitting on a powder keg, surrounded by the most efficient secret police force in Europe, knowing that a single slip of the tongue, A single suspicious glance from a neighbour could lead them to the guillotine. Yet they persisted. They turned the French judicial system into a sieve. Information flowed out to London, and British agents flowed in, protected by the very stamps and signatures of the government they were fighting. The wolf was not at the door. The wolf was already inside, wearing the clothes of a sheep, sitting at the desk and dipping its pen in the ink. Once embedded within the machinery of the French state, the British network did not sit idle. They did not merely observe, they acted. But their actions were not the dramatic, explosive sabotage of resistance movies. There were no bridges blown at midnight, no factories set ablaze. Instead, they waged a war of subtlety, a campaign that modern intelligence officers would recognize as lawfare. They turned the strict, codified laws of the Napoleonic Code into a weapon against the regime that created them. The primary battlefield was the courtroom. Napoleon prided himself on restoring order to France, on establishing a legal system where justice was swift and uniform. The British agents turned this pride into a liability. When a key royalist asset was arrested, perhaps a courier carrying letters from London or a safe-house keeper, the network swung into action. But instead of a daring prison break, they launched a bureaucratic rescue operation. British gold, the famous Cavendish sovereigns, flowed into the pockets of the jurés, the jurors who held the fate of the accused in their hands. In provincial courts, where oversight from Paris was lax, a bribe of a few hundred francs, a fortune to a struggling tradesman, could ensure a verdict of not guilty due to insufficient evidence. Prosecutors, too, were targeted. A quiet word from a respected clerk, hinting that the wind might soon blow from a different political direction, was often enough to make a prosecutor lose his zeal. They whispered that the Bourbons might return, and when they did, mercy shown today would be remembered tomorrow. This judicial sabotage was devastatingly effective. It meant that the police could arrest the enemies of the state, but the courts would not convict them. It created a revolving door of treason, demoralizing the police forces who saw their hard work undone by a soft judiciary. The most dramatic example of this manipulation occurred in the aftermath of the infernal machine plot of 1800, a failed assassination attempt where a bomb exploded near Napoleon's carriage. In the chaos that followed, the British-funded networks in Paris went into overdrive. While the police scrambled for leads, agents within the administration spread misinformation, planting evidence and rumours that pointed the finger squarely at the Jacobins, the radical left-wing revolutionaries. Napoleon, already hateful of the Jacobins, eagerly swallowed the bait. He purged the political left, exiling innocent men, while the true perpetrators, the royalist agents funded by Britain, slipped away into the shadows, protected by the very confusion they had helped to manufacture. It was a masterclass in deflection, using the emperor's own prejudices to blind him to the real threat. But the war was not just legal, it was psychological. Wickham's organization understood the power of the esprit public, the public spirit. They knew that Napoleon's rule depended on the perception of invincibility and stability. To shatter this image, they unleashed a torrent of fake news, centuries before the term existed. Clandestine printing presses in London and hidden basements in Paris churned out thousands of pamphlets. These documents, seemingly written by concerned French citizens, spread poisonous rumours. They claimed Napoleon was insane, that he was suffering from epileptic fits, or that he was secretly negotiating a shameful surrender to England. In one particularly audacious campaign, they circulated reports that Napoleon had died in battle, causing temporary panic in the stock market and proving just how fragile the regime's stability really was. This psychological warfare extended to the economy. The British government sanctioned the industrial-scale forgery of French currency. Agents flooded the markets with counterfeit francs, so perfect that even bank tellers could not distinguish them. The goal was not just to fund their own operations, but to debase the currency itself. They wanted to trigger inflation, destroy the savings of the French middle class, and clog the civil courts with thousands of lawsuits over bad debts and fraudulent payments. They turned the French people against each other. Every lawsuit filed over a fake banknote was a clog in the system, a drain on resources, and a seed of resentment against a government that could not protect the value of money. The courts became gridlocked, not by accident, but by design, through manipulated verdicts, misdirected investigations, and economic sabotage. The British spies were doing something remarkable. They were making the French Empire feel dysfunctional. They were stripping away the veneer of order that Napoleon had worked so hard to build, proving to the common people that their emperor could not guarantee justice, truth, or even the value of the coin in their pocket. But every action has an equal and opposite reaction. While William Wickham pulled strings from Switzerland and London, playing the puppet master, he was not operating in a vacuum. In Paris, sitting at a desk piled high with dossiers, was a man who arguably understood the dark arts of espionage better than anyone in Europe. If Wickham was the architect of the offence, this man was the master of the defence. His name was Joseph Fouché, the Minister of Police. History has painted Fouché as a cold, reptilian figure, a man who survived the guillotine of the Terror, the rise of the Directory, and the coup of Napoleon, always landing on his feet. He was the perfect antagonist for the British Secret Service. Fouché did not panic in the face of infiltration. He absorbed it. He understood that a spy network was like a living organism. It needed to breathe, to communicate, to move. And where it moved, it left tracks. Fouché's counter-espionage machine was centered around the notorious Cabinet Noir, or Black Room. Hidden within the main post office in Paris, this was a secret chamber where the privacy of correspondence went to die. Here, expert technicians worked with surgical precision. They would intercept mail suspected of coming from royalist sympathizers, melt the wax seals over steam without breaking them, copy the contents, and then reseal the letters so perfectly that the recipient would never know they had been read. For years, Fouché played a terrifying game of cat and mouse with Wickham. When the Cabinet Noir identified a British network, Fouché often refused to arrest them immediately. To him, a known spy was far more useful than a dead one. He would let the agents run, watching who they met, where they slept, and who they bribed. He allowed British gold to circulate just long enough to identify everyone who touched it. Even more deviously, Fouché turned the British weapon against itself. He captured minor agents and offered them a stark choice: the guillotine or a salary. Many chose life. These double agents became Fouché's mouthpieces, feeding Wickham's handlers in London exactly what the French police wanted them to hear. They requested more money for non-existent bribes and reported the movements of phantom French regiments, causing the British War Office to chase shadows. But this game of shadows had a very real and very bloody human cost. The psychological toll on the deep cover agents was immense. Living in the heart of the enemy capital, surrounded by Fouché's spies, they existed in a state of perpetual paranoia. Every knock at the door, every glance from a stranger could mean the end. The tragedy of this unseen war is best personified by the fate of Captain John Wesley Wright. As we discovered earlier, Wright was the daring naval officer who ferried agents across the Channel. He was the lifeline of the operation. But in 1804, his luck ran out. His ship was becalmed off the coast of Brittany and surrounded by French gunboats. Captured, he was not treated as a prisoner of war. To Napoleon and Fouché, he was a spy, a criminal facilitator of treason. Wright was hauled to Paris and thrown into the ominous Temple Prison, a medieval fortress that had become a dungeon for the regime's most dangerous enemies. For months, Fouché's men interrogated him. They wanted the codes, the names, the landing sites. Wright, a man of iron principle, refused to speak. Then, one morning, he was found dead in his cell, his throat cut. The official French report claimed suicide. The British government and Wright's friends shouted murder. They believed Fouché had him silenced when torture failed to break him. Wright became a martyr, a grim symbol of the stakes involved. The climax of this phase of the war came with the unravelling of the great conspiracy involving General Pichegru and the Chuan leader, Georges Cadoudal. Fouché had watched them for months, allowing them to enter Paris, allowing them to meet, tightening the net inch by inch. When he finally snapped the trap shut, it was devastating. Pichegru was found strangled in his cell, another suicide that smelled of police work. Cadoudal, the giant Breton warrior, was dragged to the guillotine, defiant to the end. The British network was rolled up. The safe houses were raided, the bribed judges were purged, and the silence of the grave descended over the royalist underground. Wickham's offensive had been blunted by the ruthless efficiency of the police state. It seemed, for a moment, that Fouché had won. But in the world of espionage, a defeat is rarely the end of the story. The network was down, but the roots had gone deeper than even Fouché realized. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and they would lie dormant, waiting for the winter of Napoleon's reign to set in. After the bloody purges of 1804, the nature of the war changed. The era of the dashing, swashbuckling spy landing on moonlit beaches was largely over. Fouché had made that game too dangerous. But in its place, something far more insidious emerged. If the first phase of the war was an attempt at assassination, the second phase was a war of attrition. A slow, deliberate poisoning of the Napoleonic social contract. The British Secret Service, now operating with even greater caution, shifted their funding to a new organisation, the Chevaliers de la Foi, or the Knights of the Faith. Unlike the previous networks, which were a loose collection of smugglers and soldiers, the Knights were a disciplined, hierarchical secret society, modelled on the Freemasons but strictly royalist and Catholic. They didn't plant bombs, they planted doubt. Their target was the very foundation of Napoleon's power, the support of the middle class and the new aristocracy. Napoleon's regime was built on a bargain. He guaranteed that the gains of the revolution, specifically the ownership of the biens nationaux, would be protected. These were the vast estates confiscated from the church and the exiled nobility during the revolution and sold to the bourgeoisie. Millions of Frenchmen, the acquéreurs, owed their wealth to this land transfer. They supported Napoleon because he was the guarantor of their property titles. The British-backed networks understood this. They realized that if they could make these landowners feel insecure, they could break the bond between the emperor and his people. Using the bottomless pockets of the British treasury, the Knights of the Faith began a campaign of legal harassment. They didn't need to win cases, they just needed to file them. Agents would scour old pre-revolutionary archives, finding obscure, centuries-old claims to the land now owned by Napoleon's loyalists. They would track down distant relatives of the original owners, pay their legal fees, and launch endless, complex lawsuits, challenging the validity of the current titles. Imagine the psychological impact. You are a prosperous French merchant. You have bought a vineyard that once belonged to a duke. You are a loyal Bonapartist. Suddenly, you are hit with a well-funded lawsuit claiming the sale was illegal due to a clerical error in 1793. The case drags on for years. You spend a fortune on lawyers. You start to wonder, if Napoleon falls, will I lose everything? This was lawfare in its purest form. By clogging the civil courts with these property disputes, the British agents created a pervasive sense of anxiety. The acquéreurs began to hedge their bets. They stopped buying national bonds. They hesitated to send their sons to the army. The solid ground beneath the regime began to turn into quicksand. Simultaneously, the network intensified its infiltration of the local administration. The Knights of the Faith were masters of obtaining mid-level government posts. They became mayors of small towns, tax collectors, and officers in the National Guard. They were the sleepers of the empire. They practiced a subtle form of administrative sabotage. Orders from Paris were misinterpreted or delayed. Taxes were collected sluggishly. Conscription lists, the lifeblood of Napoleon's wars, were riddled with errors, allowing the sons of royalist sympathizers to avoid the draft while ensuring that the burden fell on the poor, stoking resentment against the emperor. This was not a war of battles, but a war of bureaucracy. It was boring, unglamorous, and utterly devastating. While Napoleon was winning glorious victories at Austerlitz and Jena, his control over his own country was being hollowed out from the inside. The British had realized that they didn't need to defeat the French army. They just needed to make the French state unworkable. As the years dragged on and the wars turned into a seemingly endless grind, this internal rot began to spread. The esprit public that Wickham and his successors targeted was crumbling. The French people were tired, and in every town hall and courthouse where a British-funded agent sat behind a desk, that fatigue was quietly, expertly cultivated into treason. By 1812, the wind had changed. Napoleon had marched the Grand Army into the frozen wastelands of Russia and returned with a ghost. The myth of invincibility was shattered in the snow, as the ragged remnants of the French army limped back across Europe, with the vengeful Russian, Prussian, and Austrian armies in pursuit. The British-funded networks in France knew that their moment had finally arrived. The long years of lawfare, bribery, and administrative sabotage were about to bear fruit. The unseen war was about to become visible. The Chevaliers de la Foi, the Knights of the Faith, received the signal. It was time to stop hiding in the shadows of the bureaucracy and step into the light. The sleepers were waking up. The critical theatre for this endgame was not in the east, where the massive battles of Leipzig were being fought, but in the south. The Duke of Wellington, having driven the French out of Spain, was crossing the Pyrenees. He was invading France itself. But Wellington was not just a general. He was a statesman who understood the value of the network Wickham had built. He knew that to conquer France with bayonets alone would be a bloody, perhaps impossible task. He needed France to conquer itself. The target was Bordeaux. Bordeaux was the fourth largest city in the empire, a wealthy port that had been economically strangled by the British naval blockade and Napoleon's trade wars. It was a powder keg of resentment. And sitting atop this powder keg, holding the match, was the mayor of Bordeaux, Jean-Baptiste Lynch. Lynch was the ultimate triumph of the infiltration strategy. On the surface, he was a loyal functionary of the empire, wearing the sash and enforcing the laws. In reality, he was a secret royalist, deeply connected to the British network. For months, while Napoleon desperately tried to raise new armies to defend Paris, Lynch was in secret communication with the British. As Wellington's troops approached the city in March 1814, the French general in charge of the garrison prepared for a siege. He expected the city authorities to rally the citizens, to man the walls, to fight for the emperor to the last man. Instead, he found himself isolated. The local National Guard, infiltrated by the Knights of the Faith, refused to obey his orders. The civil administration, staffed by years of careful placement by British agents, paralyzed the city's defences. On March 12, 1814, a remarkable scene unfolded. It was the culmination of 2 decades of espionage. As the British vanguard appeared on the horizon, they did not lower their bayonets for a charge. They heard no cannon fire. Instead, the gates of Bordeaux swung open. Mayor Lynch, wearing the tricolour sash of the empire, rode out to meet the British troops. In a dramatic gesture of betrayal or liberation, depending on your perspective, he tore the tricolour sash from his chest, threw it to the ground, and donned the white cockade of the Bourbon monarchy. He declared Bordeaux for the king, Louis XVIII. This was the coup de grace. It wasn't a military defeat, it was a political collapse. The news that a major French city had voluntarily surrendered and welcomed the enemy sent shockwaves through the empire. It shattered the narrative that France was united behind Napoleon. It signalled to every other wavering official, every bribed clerk, and every scared magistrate that the end was near, and that it was time to switch sides. The British spies had delivered a city on a silver platter, without a shot being fired in anger. The network of forged passports, bribed jurors, and whispered rumours had metastasized into open rebellion. Napoleon's police state, so terrifying under Fouché, suddenly looked like a paper tiger. Fouché himself, ever the survivor, saw the writing on the wall. He began to distance himself from the master he had failed to protect from the rot within. The road to Paris was open. The unseen war had cleared the path for the final act. The fall of Bordeaux was the first domino, but the ultimate prize was Paris. As the Allied armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria closed the ring of steel around the French capital in late March 1814, the British secret network inside the city played its final, most dangerous card. For years, William Wickham and his agents had been cultivating a relationship with the one man in Paris who rivaled Fouché in cunning, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Talleyrand, the former foreign minister, was the ultimate political chameleon. He had served the church, the revolution, the Directory, and the emperor. Now, sensing the shift in the wind that the British spies had helped create, he was ready to serve the king. Talleyrand became the nexus of the anti-Napoleon conspiracy. His mansion in Paris effectively became the headquarters of the opposition, right under the nose of the police. But by this point, the police were paralyzed. The cabinet noir, once the all-seeing eye of the regime, had gone blind. Why? Because the men staffing it, the clerks, the analysts, the messengers, had seen the writing on the wall. The years of lawfare and administrative sabotage had convinced them that the empire was a sinking ship. In the final days, intelligence reports that should have gone to Napoleon were being diverted to Talleyrand and through him to the Allied commanders. On March 31st, 1814, the Allied armies entered Paris. But thanks to the groundwork laid by the British networks, they did not enter as destroyers. They entered into a city that had been carefully stage-managed to receive them. The Chevaliers de la Foi, the secret society funded by London, organised a spectacle of spontaneous joy. Hundreds of royalist agents, wearing white cockades that had been secretly manufactured and stockpiled in basements for months, flooded the boulevards. They cheered the Russian Tsar and the Prussian king. They tore down the statues of Napoleon. To the foreign conquerors, it looked as though Paris was begging to be liberated. It was a masterstroke of optical warfare. It gave the Allies the political cover they needed to demand nothing less than Napoleon's unconditional abdication. Meanwhile, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon sat alone. He still had the army. He still had the will to fight. He planned a suicidal counterattack on Paris. But the rot of the unseen war had finally reached the highest echelons of the military. His marshals, Ney, Lefebvre, MacDonald, refused to march. These men were brave soldiers, but they were also landowners. They were the beneficiaries of the new titles and wealth the empire had created. For a decade, British psychological warfare had whispered that their wealth was only safe if the war ended. The endless lawsuits, the economic instability caused by counterfeit currency, the sheer exhaustion of a society constantly under surveillance, it all culminated in this moment of mutiny. The marshals chose their estates over their emperor. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated. The giant had fallen. But as the Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, returned to the throne, carried on the baggage train of the Allies, a strange thing happened. The unseen war did not end with a parade. It simply vanished. The agents who had risked the guillotine, the clerks who had forged the passports, the smugglers who had braved the Channel, they slipped back into the shadows. There were no medals for the men who had fought this war. To acknowledge them would be to admit that the restoration of the monarchy was not the will of God or the people, but the result of a 20-year campaign of bribery, subversion, and espionage. The new government, terrified of looking like puppets of the British, buried the truth. The files of the Alien Office were locked away. The names of the traitors were redacted. The narrative was sanitized. History recorded the great battles and the treaties. It recorded the genius of Wellington and the hubris of Napoleon. But it largely forgot the silent army that had opened the gates from the inside. The story of the Napoleonic Wars usually ends with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a singular, cataclysmic day of violence that finally put the Corsican ogre in his grave, metaphorically and eventually literally. But the legacy of the unseen war did not end on that muddy field in Belgium. Its echoes reverberated far beyond the 19th century, shaping the very nature of how nations fight, how they gather information, and how they destabilize their enemies. When we look back at William Wickham and his Foreign Office Secret Service, we are not looking at a historical curiosity. We are looking at the blueprint for the modern intelligence agency. Before Wickham, spying was the domain of the lone adventurer, the courtier whispering behind a fan, or the scout riding ahead of the army. It was personal, ad hoc, and often amateurish. Wickham changed the game. He industrialized espionage. He introduced the concept of a permanent, budget-allocated secret service that operated independently of the military chain of command. He created the secret vote in Parliament, a mechanism that allowed the government to spend millions of pounds on foreign objects without having to explain where the money went. This wall of financial secrecy is the direct ancestor of the black budgets that fund the CIA, MI6, and the DGSE today. The techniques developed in the fight against Napoleon, the infiltration of the civil service, the weaponization of bureaucracy, the use of economic sabotage, and the creation of front organizations like the Knights of the Faith became the standard playbook for statecraft. We see the DNA of Wickham's operation in the Special Operations Executive, SOE, of World War II, which Churchill ordered to set Europe ablaze, using almost identical methods of subversion. We see it in the Cold War, where the battle for hearts and minds was fought with propaganda, funding of dissident groups, and the manipulation of political processes, just as it was in the salons of Paris in 1804. Furthermore, this conflict taught Britain a lesson that would define its foreign policy for a century. That a small island nation could project power not just through its navy, but through its gold and its intelligence. It established the idea that information was a commodity as valuable as gunpowder. The archives of the Alien Office, though heavily redacted and purged, reveal a sophisticated understanding of human intelligence, HUMINT, that rivals anything in the 20th century. However, there is a darker legacy to this unseen war. It marked the end of the gentleman's war. By paying criminals to forge currency, by bribing judges to miscarriage justice, and by plotting assassinations with religious fanatics, the British government crossed moral lines that could never be uncrossed. They proved that in a war for national survival, the end justifies the means. The romantic image of the redcoats standing tall in a line was supplemented by the shadowy figure of the agent in a dark room, handling tainted money. The men who fought this war paid a heavy price. William Wickham retired exhausted and largely uncelebrated, his health broken by the stress of running a continental network. Captain Wright lies in a forgotten grave in Paris, a victim of the game he played. Thousands of nameless Frenchmen who took British coin to betray their emperor vanished into the mists of history, their stories too inconvenient for the narrative of French nationalism or British honour. Today, if you walk through the quiet, dusty aisles of the National Archives in Kew, or visit the old streets of Paris near the Palais de Justice, there are no monuments to the Alien Office or the Agence de Paris. But the world we live in, a world of surveillance, of deep cover operatives, of information warfare, is the world they built. Napoleon Bonaparte claimed that he was defeated by the cavalry of St. George, a euphemism for British gold sovereigns. He was right, but it wasn't just the gold that defeated him, it was the men who carried it. It was the clerks who misfiled the papers. It was the whispers in the dark. It was the silent, unseen war that proved, once and for all, that while armies can conquer land, Only intelligence can conquer a state. Thank you for joining us on this expedition into the shadows of the Napoleonic Wars. It's a side of history that rarely makes it into the textbooks, but as we've seen, it was just as decisive as the charge of the Heavy Brigade. If you enjoyed uncovering these secrets with us, please take a moment to like this video. It really helps the channel. Make sure you are subscribed to British War History and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the conflicts that shaped our world. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the British were justified in using lawfare and assassination plots, or did they go too far? Let's discuss down below. Until next time.